Can't hear me. Now, I was given a pretty broad remit for this provocative talk on ecosystem services and human well-being. And I suppose I want to sort of preface what I'm going to say by really sort of saying that I suppose my interest in this and my research is driven by this big question, which is really about how can very poor people, like these women gleaners in Mozambique, benefit from ecosystem services. So that's in a way, I suppose, the question that drives my inquiry. And this afternoon, what I'd like to do is really to make three points, and I hope, either by happy coincidence or perhaps just very careful crafting, that this follows on quite nicely from the discussions this morning. So I want to really make the argument that to understand this intricate relationship between ecosystems and human well-being, we need to disaggregate our analysis, because once we start getting below the global, it's when we can start to tease out the complexities, the dynamics, and some of the sort of conflicts, tensions, and trade-offs that we've already started to talk about. And that as soon as we do that, we start to see how trade-offs, both between different ecosystem services or ecosystem service bundles, between different actors or stakeholders, and also between different aspects of well-being play out and their importance in understanding these relationships. And finally, I want to look a little bit at how we can analyse the factors that actually mediate in these relationships between ecosystems and human well-being. So to start off really looking at why do we need to disaggregate our analysis of these relationships. Again, we heard this morning how coming out of initiatives like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, there's this common assumption really that ecosystem services deliver benefits for human beings, and that in a way the implication is that if we can increase the flows of ecosystem services, then that will enhance and increase human well-being. But of course, we also know that actually increasing ecosystem services doesn't necessarily contribute to well-being, and certainly doesn't necessarily contribute to poverty alleviation, which is actually the sort of core business and core interest, I think, of many of us ultimately. And we also importantly know that the outcomes have different impacts on different people in society. For example, access is a very important factor. So in this little diagram here, if we increase the flow of ecosystem services, that might well benefit, person B or group of people B, but actually person A or group of people A are unable to benefit from those enhanced flows of ecosystem services because they can't access those benefits, and that might be because they don't have property rights, so they can't harvest or they can't exploit resources. They might not have knowledge, they might not have information, they might not have technology, they might not have labour available. So we need to understand what those barriers to access are. Or in this case, we know that people have different needs, and so that will also affect how they can benefit from ecosystem services. So in this example, if we actually have a degrading ecosystem, so we have a loss of ecosystem services, then that might well affect person or group of people A much more than B, because A actually is poorer and has fewer resources, fewer sources of livelihood, compared to B, who might well have ways in which they can compensate or substitute for those benefits. So we need to understand these mediating factors, and we need to disaggregate our analysis. I want to say a little bit then about how we might also understand well-being as a much more multidimensional concept when we're trying to understand the linkages between ecosystems and human well-being. And we heard a little bit this morning, we started a discussion about that, and certainly acknowledged the importance of recognising both objective aspects of well-being, so things that we can go out and measure, like possibly health and income and so on, but also subjective dimensions, and somebody mentioned the psychological or the psychosocial dimensions of well-being. And certainly in many countries now we're seeing a sort of explosion of interest, for example, in measuring happiness. And so in some of our research funded by the ESPA programme, which is the Ecosystem Services and Poverty Alleviation Programme, I know some of you are already involved in that research programme, we actually went out to different coastal stakeholders in Kenya and asked them, what do you need to live well? And of course, what happens when you ask people that is you get a whole range and a whole mix of both these objective and subjective aspects of well-being. So, of course, poor people talk a lot about the importance of money in supporting their well-being, about the importance of regular employment, but they also talk about much less tangible things. Like in coastal Kenya, we have this idea of the developmental mind, mwazo. I don't know if there's an equivalent here, which is sort of to do with knowledge and education, entrepreneurship. I think in Britain we'd call it nous. It's sort of actually a part of this sort of everyday working knowledge and contacts, and it's got a bit of social relations and networks in there as well. So we get this kind of list of these kind of quite incommensurate aspects of well-being. And of course what's significant is that different people in society rank these differently. So for some people, money is very important, but for others, for example, in our research, women fish traders, women fishmongers, good neighbours and security are particularly important. So disaggregating how we understand well-being, I would argue, is also very important. The second point I wanted to make, and again it was highlighted, I think, and articulated very well this morning, is that actually trade-offs are the norm in these relationships rather than the exceptions. And especially in the type of work that I do, understanding not only these trade-offs between different ecosystem services, but also between different objectives. So, for example, between maximising income versus conserving biodiversity, but also between different actors or different stakeholders is really important. So again, in our Kenya research, one of the kind of key sort of trade-offs which we were interested in was in looking at how to regulate beach seine fishing, which is mainly undertaken by quite small-scale, quite poor fishers, but actually has detrimental impacts on the fishery because it takes a lot of young and small fish out of the system. But although we could see that there would be clear benefits for the health of the fishery and the ecosystem if you could actually enforce a ban on beach seine fishing, it would also have highly detrimental impacts on women fish traders who depended on these cheap small fish for their livelihoods. So you can see this sort of immediate trade-off there. And of course, depending on your overall objective, either conserving your fishery or perhaps supporting income generation for the poorest stakeholders in your system, then you might actually view that management strategy quite differently. So the importance really is highlights that there are winners and losers in any change in ecosystem management. Again, I think was mentioned this morning. So I want to talk a little bit now about how we might start to unpick these relationships. And I was very pleased when Graham this morning talked about chains, because actually in a new project which we're just starting called Spaces, which I'll tell you a bit more about because it's remarkably has the the same letters in its acronym as SAPECS, we're using this sort of conceptual framework of a chain to try and understand how ecosystems on the left-hand side of this chain might deliver well-being benefits or well-being contributions to different people in society. So I want to sort of talk you through this chain. But first of all, my own well-being needs a bit of water. So, we can understand that, this transformation process which Graham talked about, by which ecological stocks are converted into a set of flows and services which are then, converted to goods that are values added and which are then shared amongst people in order to make contributions to their welfare or well-being, is actually mediated by a set of really important factors. On the one hand, environmental change or climate change impacts on the way in which ecosystems, the state of ecosystems, but then there's this complex set of ecological relationships and dynamics, the sort of production functions that Graham talked about, which then determine how flows of ecosystem services are produced from those ecosystems. We then have a number of human inputs, be that technology or labour or whatever, that then converts those flows into goods. And of course, there are then a whole range of processes which add value to those goods, and that's not only how they are traded through markets, but it's also how social relationships add value and different cultural values are expressed through these goods. And then these access mechanisms determine how they're shared amongst different people. But then different people have quite different needs, so they will contribute to welfare in quite different ways according to those needs. So we can see that, on the left-hand side of this chain is a lot of the ecological work. It's where much of the existing work through the MA, through TEEB and through other initiatives has taken place. On the right-hand side, you see the sort of core focus of social science work, and where a lot of the work that I've been involved in has also focused. Ideas like environmental entitlements have analysed this end of the chain. And what we would like to do in our new project, which is a collaboration, myself at Exeter University, Tim Daw and others at Stockholm Research Centre, and more than 30 partners throughout Eastern Africa, is actually to empirically examine this whole chain. So to look at, the social-ecological system which is articulated through this ecosystem well-being chain. And that will involve both field measurements of stocks and flows from ecosystems, particularly focusing on coral reef systems and mangrove systems. It will involve modelling the impacts of different changes and on stocks and flows. And also then, at the other end of the chain, undertaking surveys of how benefits are distributed amongst different sectors of society, and looking at both objective and subjective assessments of human needs and well-being. So, for example, this little diagram in the corner is from some of our earlier work in Kenya, where we ran focus groups with different coastal stakeholders, and this just in a way shows is the pattern of well-being derived from focus group interviews with women fish traders. So we'll do this new project, this new work where we're going to really try and flesh out and empirically investigate these chains in 4 different sites, in Mozambique and in Kenya, and in remote and peri-urban sites in both of those countries. And of course, the sort of underlying hypothesis, I suppose, which drives this research is that actually these chains will look quite different in different contexts. So we might postulate, for example, that in remote northern Mozambique, we have ecosystems, which are relatively pristine, I suppose you could say, and where there are high levels of flows of services, and that actually these are quite sparsely populated areas where there's not high rates of exploitation or harvest. And certainly there are no functioning markets, and where they're pretty much open access resources, but where we actually have very poor populations of people who have relatively few alternative sources of livelihood, so they have high needs. Whereas in peri-urban Mombasa in Kenya, we get a quite different sort of shape to this chain. So we know that it's a highly, there's a lot of impacts both from environmental change, but also very high rates of exploitation. But at the moment, there's still quite high flows of services. For example, there's still actually a very productive fishery associated with coral reefs outside Mombasa. There's a huge amount of human effort, lots of different types of fishing activity, for example, and there's a lot of value added, not only through quite intense markets, but also through social and cultural values. But in fact, we probably have, in the main, people who have access to alternative sources of livelihood, so we might say that actually their needs are not as high as in northern Mozambique sites, potentially. So our ambition really is to map these chains at these 4 different sites. But of course, each of these sites, as many of the systems that we examine around the world, and particularly in the developing world, are immensely dynamic, both socially, economically, environmentally, ecologically. And so we have to understand these chains within these highly dynamic situations. And to do that, we need to understand the trends, the drivers, and so on. And we need to engage specifically with the different stakeholders who are involved in managing and using these systems. So in a current project that we're working in Kenya, again sponsored by ESPA, we've been developing these participatory concept system maps to work with different stakeholders to identify the trends, the drivers, and also possible future scenarios. We've also, and again with the help of Gary Peterson particularly, who's been working on these participatory toy models, so that we can bring together the findings from different aspects of the research that we've been doing. So, for example, the bottom here shows the way, the sort of bottom set of orange squares here show how different stakeholders construct their well-being. Incorporate this with an ecological model of the system, and then on the top left-hand side, the different drivers of change which stakeholders have identified. And we can create these toy models which then looks at, hey, what happens when you change these drivers to, on the top right-hand side, profitability, ecology, and food, for example, and actually get the people who are involved in managing the system to sit down and look at the impact and potential future scenarios, so that they can then talk through, hey, depending on what we want to, our objectives are, how best can we start to manage this system. And we've also used more narrative-based and qualitative scenarios to work with other primary stakeholders to basically be able to explore the key processes of change and where the trade-offs are. Because, of course, ultimately, in being able to expose and discuss these trade-offs, to look at where the trade-offs are, who they're important for, and which ones are acceptable, and which might be completely unacceptable or taboo, we can then start to identify where the points of intervention in the system are, and these sort of these levers that we've been talking about for policy. So the new project, which we're going to be starting in the next month or so, is, as I said, it's called SAPECS, so it's got the same sort of letters in its acronym. So Munsi and I had a bit of a laugh about that. It stands for Sustainable Poverty Alleviation, from Ecosystem Services, and we're very much hoping that it will interface with the PECS work. And I wanted at the very end just to pose the provocative question, which is, given the importance of these mediating factors in our chains, could it be that actually can poor people benefit from ecosystem services unless we address the structural reasons for their poverty, given the importance of those factors? So thank you very much.